Good afternoon. It is good to be with everybody. Come and join us. I'm going to move over there in a second too, but I'm going to say a couple comments, then sign the bill into law, and then we'll take some questions and give you a chance to ask about this and other items out there. First off, I just want to say it's perfect timing, because about an hour ago I stood in this room handing out proclamations for a series of different organizations that have been promoting financial literacy and highlighting that, particularly in the month of April. And it's appropriate that we're signing this legislation in the same room an hour after that, because what we're really talking about is a Balanced Budget Act that allows state government to finish fiscal year 2011, which ends June 30th of this year, with a balanced budget. It's something we set out to do about a month and a half ago, and we're finally seeing the complete package come through, because for us it was a series of things that we needed to do in state government to make sure we finished fiscal year 2011 without going into a deficit. Obviously, we faced a deficit without this action for later this year, just as we're taking some swift action to correct the $3.6 billion deficit we face going into the next biennial budget process. This is important for us because, again, we need to finish the year in balance, in check. This allows us to do that. We take the components in the Balanced Budget Act today, combined with the budget reforms that I signed into law about 3.5 weeks ago, and this gives us the tools to make sure that for the remainder of this year we have a balanced budget. I appreciate the lawmakers who are here today and others along with them. It was nice to get back to a measure that was passed in a bipartisan vote. Certainly we saw that in the first 5 or 6 weeks of the legislative session this year, where on bills that we brought forward as part of our jobs agenda, we saw Republicans and Democrats alike voting to push forward measures that talk about creating more jobs in the private sector here in Wisconsin. We haven't stopped working on jobs. We're going to continue to focus on jobs, and my hope is with this measure passed this week, we can get back to a point where Democrats join with Republicans and working together to get this state moving in the right direction, and ultimately in helping us help the private sector put more people to work. That's what this is really all about. That's what the Balanced Budget Act is about, and it gives us the tools to move forward and make sure we finish off the fiscal year with a balanced budget. With that, I'm going to sign the act, and then we'll take some questions. With that, we'll take questions if you got them.
So, Rick, can we talk about the election last
Sure.
night? The Supreme Court race is still very, very close and expected to turn into some sort of a recount effort. But it appears Mike Poffenberg may be ahead, at least at this point in time. What do you make of that? They tried to turn that into a referendum on origin.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. The results show, and obviously a lot will change probably in the next couple hours and the next day or two, depending on what happens with the recount. But I think it's pretty clear. You have two very different worlds in the state. You've got a world driven by Madison and a world driven by everybody else out across the majority of the rest of the state of Wisconsin. What that tells me is, just as you've seen in past elections, for president, for governor, for other offices, Wisconsin's not a red state, it's not a blue state. In many ways, it's a purple state. And it's divided on these issues. And what we're charged with having to do, I believe, is find ways to bring this state together. And one of the best ways, and why I was pleased why there were bipartisan votes for this measure, is to get back talking about jobs, because I think that's the thing that can unite the state. It's not Republican jobs, they're not Democrat jobs, they're ultimately Wisconsin jobs, and we get focused on that. I think we're going to bring people together.
Democrats talked about some of the wins they had in other areas though besides Madison. For example, Tom Nelson winning in Allegheny County over Jack Boyd, a pretty prominent Republican former state treasurer. Chris Abley taking pretty handily your former seat in Milwaukee County. What do you make of some of those other races? What does that mean?
I think it makes, for example, in Milwaukee County, I think it's, if you follow the numbers tell the story. Milwaukee County, before I was elected, had never elected a Republican before. Historically, over 60% of the vote goes Democrat. It is a dark blue county in a race where Chris Abley outspent Jeff Stone 4-1. I think any objective observer would tell you that was a logical outcome in terms of the vote there. In fact, actually Jeff Stone got slightly more percentage vote than I got even in the gubernatorial race in Milwaukee County last year. That is a historically Democratic county, just like Dane County and others. You saw other Republicans like Jim Ladwig winning in Racine County, other similar wins like that around the state. I think what it showed is on an issue-by-issue basis around the state, people won based on their record and what they were talking about on the local level, not what they were for or against when it came to the statewide issues.
Do you worry if there's a long, drawn-out, contentious recount effort? Certainly understandable why both sides would want that with as close as it is, but that would be one more thing that would make people feel disgusted with government being one big fight.
I don't think so, as long as it's fair. I mean, to me, democracy it guarantees that you give everybody a right, and everybody has a right to have a say. And in this case, if it takes a few days or a week or so to effectively and fairly go through that recount, I think where people get frustrated with recounts is if where they think people are changing the rules. As long as the rules are clear, as long as there aren't ballots somewhere somehow found out of the blue that weren't counted before, things of that nature, as long as everything's above board and people understand what's at stake here, I think that's fair. I think what would frustrate people is if somehow we allowed what may or may not happen with a recount in the Supreme Court race to keep us from doing the work that we were elected to do here in the state of Wisconsin. That's, I think, overwhelming, at least for the people who elected me and even for those who didn't. They want us to focus on jobs. They want us to focus on our goal of 250,000 new jobs. And as long as we're not distracted from that, I don't think you're going to see that kind of frustration. I think that the bigger frustration in the Supreme Court, not only this, but in the last election, is the amount of money coming in from outside of the candidates and outside of the state. And I think that's probably the biggest frustration that most voters have in Wisconsin.
Governor, what about the part of the budget repair bill that's now tied up in legal limbo, the collective bargaining piece? You had said previously if you didn't get $30 million in savings this fiscal year, 1,500 layoffs were an option, were a likely option. So where does that stand now that you basically don't get that savings this year?
Well, we don't yet. My hope is, I'm still an optimist. I still believe the law is clear and given time for the court to act. I don't believe it will go as far as some is predicting. My hope would be in the next week or two, the courts could see fit to look at all the evidence and to make a decision. I believe when they do, when the court does make that decision, it'll give us the option to go forward. I no longer believe it's a question of if this is the law. It's a question of will it be at what point will it be officially enacted. And so from that standpoint, I still believe it gives us some time to look at that. And we've got a ways yet. The first impact wouldn't be until checks later this month. And again, we're going to give it some time. Certainly having the fiscal tools that we're given now through the law I just signed, or the bill I just signed into law, gives us some breathing room because that was part of the total package. It wasn't just the $30 million, it was the total package addressing all the fiscal concerns we had to finish fiscal year 11 with a balance. But we're obviously going to be monitoring that day by day and be prepared, hopefully, in time for the court to give us a swift action.
Governor, in terms of the recall elections, what do you think the turnout and the overall results of the Supreme Court, yesterday's Supreme Court election, say about those recalls?
I think if you look at the vast majority of places around the state where there'll be Senate recall elections potentially, the numbers clearly suggest that and I don't believe it was a referendum. I believe this is about people having a choice between two different candidates, two different backgrounds. But for those who believe it's a referendum, while it might have a statewide impact that may lean one way or the other, it's largely driven by Madison and to a lesser extent Milwaukee. But those Senate recall elections in both the Democrat and Republican side are not being held in Madison and they're not being held in Milwaukee. They're being held in other parts of the state. And by overwhelming majorities, in most of those parts, Justice Prosser was the one who was victorious there. So I think those results are pretty clear. At the most charged time, the time when they're the most charged up of any, even in those areas, if you do believe it's a referendum, and I don't, I think it bodes well for those senators.
Governor, you just spoke to concerns about outside spending in the state Supreme Court race. Given that concern, a lot of observers would say you just made the case for fully funding public financing for those races.
Well, in our case, what we've talked about in the past is being honest about. And a negative checkoff, which many people are surprised to know is money that comes out of their taxpayer dollars no matter whether they make the checkoff or not, I don't think is an honest way of dealing with it. Why I propose to change in the state budget in that regard. If people want to fund that, and they might very well after they've seen the last couple of Supreme Court races, then they should take the time to check that off under a true checkoff system. That's not what we have right now. The checkoff doesn't add any more to your tax bill or deduct any from your liability. It's there no matter what. And that's one of the problems I've had with that system.
Got time for maybe one more? Anyone has one more?
You covered all your bases. That's pretty good. Great, thanks.